Well, hello, 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 hello. It is travel time. Time to do a little traveling through the Word. So let's see what we have. We are on week 14. Old Testament includes Joshua 14 through 24, Judges 1 through 6, Psalm 15, 16, and 1. No, that's true. 15, 16, and 116. And then we had New Testament travels, which included Luke 17 through 21. So, if you are new here, here's the routine. I give you some high points from each scripture, each chapter of the book, and then I tell you how I see me, and then I ask you a question so that we can ensure that you find yourself in there too. And so, all of our toes get stepped on. Anyway, here we go. Joshua, starting at chapter 14. They discuss Israel's inheritance in Canaan, and that was based on God's covenant with Moses, and it was done by casting lots. And then we talked about Caleb's inheritance, because remember, he and Joshua were the only two that remained from that wilderness crew. And then we get to chapter 15, and we have Judah's inheritance, and Judah would be the one where eventually the Messiah would come from, with King David. And while the Israelites could not defeat the group of people that were there, King David would eventually do that. And in this chapter, it talked a lot about how the family was the foundation of society in Israel. Because just as they passed down physical, material blessings, they were really more concerned with passing down spiritual blessings. And so the legacy that a father, a real man of God left was a spiritual legacy that held more, carried more weight, went further than the other legacy that he left. So that was a big deal. So, for our fathers who we need to be, the foundational landmark of society when it comes to families, that's your job. That's your role. So chapter 15, you can deep dive into Joshua chapter 15. And then we get to chapter 16, and we talk about Joseph and Ephraim's inheritance. And remember, we're going through all the tribes and the inheritance they get. Well, they didn't drive out all the Canaanites. And so it ended up becoming like a disease or a cancer, how it spreads. It starts slowly sometimes, and then you don't even realize how far it's gone when you don't do anything with it. And so then there was chapter 17, and it was West Manasseh's inheritance. Once again, they were afraid of some of the Canaanites. They were a huge tribe. And Joshua basically reprimanded them and reminded them that God had told them earlier, you will need faith in action to see my hand move. And so they were afraid. So Joshua had to get on to them. And then we get to chapter 18, and there's that land distribution at Shiloh, which is Benjamin's inheritance. And we realize, here's the point of that. The promise of God is within reach, yet faith is the thing that puts it in your hand. So this is what happened to them here. They kept relying on the promise of God, which is wonderful, but you need some faith in action to actually grab hold of it. And so for me, I said, Lord, continue to remind me that although you have purpose for me, my walk in faith is what brings it to my reality. So that was for me. For you, my question for you is, what falls? These are like tragedies, triumphs, suffering, not triumphs, tragedies, things that have happened, things that made you struggle. What falls have happened in your life because you refused to drive out that thing or that person that you knew was an enemy of God? Okay? So what resulted from that, basically? And then we get to Joshua chapter 19, and we talk about the inheritance of Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and Joshua, who gets his inheritance last because as a leader, he understood the lead shall be last. And so That was a sign of a good leader. Chapter 20, they start talking about the cities of refuge, because remember, these had to be established in case there was someone who, killed somebody, but it was by mistake. They had a city to go to while they, had a whole court thing going on, legal thing happening. So there had to be a city close enough for a person to be able to get to quickly. So all the places had to have a city of refuge. Chapter 21, this was the cities of the Levites, because remember, they didn't get the heritage land because they were responsible for so many other things. So there were cities where they lived, the cities of the Levites and the descendants of Abram. And so they were located sporadically around so that the Israelites, all of the Israelites, would have access to be able to be taught the statutes of the Lord. And so that's what that was. Chapter 21, verse 45, that's like the whole basic summary of so many things having to do with the Old Testament. And it basically talks about God is faithful. He's going to fulfill. If he says something, he makes the promises, he is faithful to fulfill it. And then you get to chapter 22, and the eastern tribes return home, because remember, the two tribes that wanted to stay on one side of Jordan, but they had to go make sure all the people were driven out of Canaan before they could go back. Well, they went back. And then they built this altar. And then the people got afraid, because they were like, remember the last time we built an altar and we all got in trouble? So they went there to question them. And then they found out that what they realized was the altar was built for God. It wasn't built for like little g gods, but they said, we don't have a temple here. The temple would be on that side of Jordan. And so we want our kids to always remember who God is. So we built this altar so that when we're gone, our children, generations after us, will remember to worship God. So then the people were okay, and they went back, and all was well. Okay. And then we have chapter 23, and we have Joshua's farewell address, and it was about being strong and obeying. Okay. Because when God's for you, it doesn't matter who or how many are against you. All right. And then chapter 24 was the review of Israel's history. And you know how they were. Remember, they had a whole cycle thing going on. It talked about the covenant renewal. Okay. And here's the deal with that. God can't work in your circumstances when your idol of choice is in the way. God can't work in your circumstances when your idol of choice is in the way. And then they had the burial of the three leaders. Joshua was buried. Remember, they brought Joseph's bones with them. That was part of the thing. He was like, don't leave my bones in Egypt, take them. And so they did, and he was buried. And then Eleazar, which was the son of Aaron, he was buried. And so I said, Lord, help me to not only remember, but to put this strategy in place. Like when I have a conflict in my life, I want this strategy. Don't act hastily and then take a stand. Don't act hastily and take a stand. And I want to do that so that it will always remind me that, guess what? I only have one ultimate source that can meet my needs. That's God. So my question to you is, they gave a definition of idol. They said, any unauthorized person, place, or thing that a person looks to as a source of purpose, provision, or promise. Okay, that's the definition. Any unauthorized person, place, or thing that a person looks to as a source of purpose, promise, or provision. All right, that's the definition. Now, my question for you is, are you willing to take inventory to see if there are any idols in your life? Meditate on that for a little bit. Take a little inventory to see if there's something there for you. Okay, then we get to Judges. Chapter 1. This is about Judah's leadership against the Canaanites. Okay. Poor little Israel. They started like doing all the right things. They were going in Canaan, And then they were taken over. And then guess what we get to? Benjamin's failure. Because they allowed the Jebusites to live among them. Okay? And then there was success in the house of Joseph. But then guess what? There were failure in the tribes of Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Like all of them allowed the one thing God said not to do. Like, don't let the people stay because you're going to end up, they'll rub off on you. And he was right. In chapter 2, they talked about the pattern of sin and judgment. Okay. And there was an angel of the Lord that came, and they described it as a Christophany. That's when a pre-incarnate manifestation of the Son of God shows up in the Old Testament. Okay. And then they gave a definition of a covenant that I like. It said it's like being glued to another person, the other party, whoever you made the covenant with, like y'all are glued together. Okay. Because you can't separate them without something from one or the other tearing. And then it talked about disobediences. Guess what? A boomerang, because it always comes back to slap you in the face. So crazy. And then the sad part about chapter 2 is they said, now here we have a whole generation of Israelites that have now rose up. And guess what? They barely know who God is. Some of them don't even know God. Because guess what happened? That family passing down, remember we talked about that? They weren't doing good with that. And they say verses 16 through 19 of chapter 2, that's a summary of the book of Judges. So here's what happened. The children of Israel depart from God, and then their enemies oppress them. And then God feels sorry for them. And then God raises up a deliverer. And then the enemies are defeated by the deliverer. And then the deliverer dies. And then Israel returns right back to their idols and depart from God again. And they lived in that cycle way too many times. And chapter 3 was the Lord test Israel. Okay. He tests Israel. And he raises up a deliverer for them. They get Othniel. He's endowed by the Spirit of God. They have peace for 40 years. Okay. But then Israel, they just go back. And so for me, I said, Father, I want my faith in the valley to match my faith on the mountain. All right. I want my faith in the valley to match my faith on the mountain. And I never want my valley problems, my valley circumstances, my valley suffering to limit or hinder my mountain faith. That's why they need to be the same. My question for you is, what test did God allow in your life to gauge your spiritual devotion and commitment to him? So what test did God allow in your life? Because he was trying to gauge your spiritual devotional commitment. And then once you figure out what that test is, just go ahead and don't tell me, just you and God talk about it. How did you do? What grade did you get if he was doing that? All right. Chapter 4. This is about Deborah, however you want to pronounce that, and Barak. And so God basically told Barak what he wanted to do through Deborah. Okay? And then we had the story of Jael, okay, who was the one who killed Sisera because he was wreaking havoc in Israel. And so Jael, who was a woman, she did that. All right? And here's just something to think about. When God and man are in partnership against a common enemy, that's the principle behind spiritual warfare. So when people say, oh my gosh, it's spiritual warfare. Well, if you're by yourself, see, it's when you and God are in partnership against a common enemy. That's when y'all are fighting spiritual warfare. Okay, chapter 5. It was Deborah's song, all right? And it talks about a mother's experience, how that's a spiritual victory because of her unique role in raising kids and submitting those kids to God's kingdom. Chapter 6 was Midian oppresses Israel. And this is what happens when you stray away from God. He sometimes will allow a crisis in your life to compel you to return to him. Then the Lord calls Gideon. All right. So God may respond to your claim of inadequacy with his promises to be with you. That's what he did for Gideon. All right. And Gideon tears down an altar of Baal. And then we get the sign of the fleece, the miracle, when Gideon needed a confirmation from God. And so that's kind of how we were. We left that at chapter 6. Well, I kind of read a little farther because, you can't start the story of Gideon without finishing, but I'm going to stop there for you guys. So it said, for me, Lord, I want to have the faith of Gideon to ask you for a miracle such as he did. Like, that's the kind of faith I want to have. I want to have the faith that says, God, I want you to leave this fleece dry while the whole entire dew of the ground is wet. And believe that it's going to happen. And my question for you is, are you expecting God to do something miraculous outside of your home when you're not willing to do what God needs you to do inside of your home? Think about that. You might have to rewind that and listen to it again. Okay, then we get to Psalms. And remember, I just give you some pieces out of Psalms that I like. Psalms 15 was a description of the godly. Who can dwell in your tent and live in your holy mountain? One who is blameless, practices righteousness, doesn't slander, acknowledges truth, keeps his word, and does not harm. Psalm 16, confidence in the Lord. Protect me, Lord. I take refuge in you. You are my Lord. I have nothing good besides you. Lord, you are my portion and my cup of blessings. You reveal the path of life to me. In your presence is abundance of joy, and at your right hand, eternal pleasures. And then Psalm 116, thanks to God for deliverance. I love the Lord because he has heard my appeal for mercy, because he has turned his ear to me. I will call out to him as long as I live. I will offer God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. That was my Psalms. Okay. And then we get to chapter 17, and we're now in Luke chapter 17. We get warnings from Jesus, and there's this whole ordeal about forgiveness. And so since forgiveness means completion in the Bible, and when they talk about forgiveness, that whole 7 times 70, well, the whole key of it is the number 7, which means we should completely forgive. Completely. Okay? And then talks about faith and duty. Okay? It's not the size of your faith, rather the genuineness of your faith that's submitted to a divine authority, which is God. Talked about the 10 men who were healed. Only one was not ashamed of a public praise and homage of thanks. We talked about the coming of the kingdom. The king stood right in front of them, yet they did not recognize him. Chapter 18, there were the parable of the persistent widow, the Pharisee and the tax collector, blessing the children. It was like the rich young ruler. There was possessions of the kingdom, the third prediction of the death of Jesus, and the blind man gets his sight. Okay. Persistence was backed by a legal right to justice. Grace is given to the humble, not the proud. The kingdom is available to those who receive it like a child. Jesus knew the ruler lacked love for his neighbor. All kingdom sacrifices are repaid in history or eternity. And how desperate are you for Jesus to intervene in your life? And then chapter 19, we start with Jesus has a visit. Jesus visits Zacchaeus. All right. Desperation will cause you to forsake your dignity when you want something from the Lord. Your outward actions should be a testimony of your inward transformation. There was the parable of the 10 minas. Okay, which a mina is 1 day's wage. Because God expects us to manage what he gave us until his return. There was about the triumphal entry, Jesus' laws for Jerusalem, and then cleansing the temple. All right, and I said, Lord, help me not to be so absorbed in the normal activities of life that I fail to take you and your kingdom work serious. You know how sometimes we get so busy, and before you know it, when is the last time you spent some time with God? Okay, it's that kind of thing. My question for you is, what is that one thing that Jesus could appeal to that might not make you walk away, but could make you stumble if he asked you to give it up? What's that one thing that if Jesus appealed to you? Now, I'm not saying it's going to make you give up Jesus, but it may make you shake, stumble, if he asked you to give it up. And then we have chapter 20. The authority of Jesus was challenged, okay? And Jesus was basically saying, why do people expect the truth when they don't want to speak the truth? Parable of the vineyard owner, okay? God is the vineyard owner. Israel is the vineyard. It was God and Caesar, all right? Remember, Caesar, God said, give to Caesar what belongs to him. Because Caesar was on the coin. But guess who we are made in the image of? God. So he said, give me what's due me. Think about that for a second. Then they talked about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Remember, they were both legalistic. They didn't like each other, but they were both legalistic ridiculousness. There was a question about Christ, and then there was a warning against scribes. Chapter 21, we get that widow's gift. Remember, it was based on percentage. She gave much more than those who gave a lot. But it wasn't, their percentage was little, but they gave a lot. The destruction of the temple was predicted because, Jesus knew that the Romans would soon come and level it. There were signs of the end of the age, destruction of Jerusalem, the coming of the Son of Man, the parable of the fig tree, and then the need for watchfulness. And so I said, Lord, help me to be alert at all times, praying for strength to be prepared for your coming. And my question for you is, are you more devoted to giving God what bears the image of man, or giving God what bears his image? Okay? What are you more concerned with? Giving God. Which one is a higher priority for you? Which one do you give more of than the other? All right. So, those are our travels for week 14. I look forward to traveling with you again. Next week, we will be doing Judges 7 through 21, Psalms 17, 21, and 146, Luke 22 through 24. We'll finish up Luke, and then we'll start in Acts. We'll have Acts 1 and 2. All right. Until then, happy traveling through the Word next week.